The warm, familiar hum of the Starbucks was a welcome break in the chaos of my life. After spending hours driving across the city, I needed a place to sit, read, and recharge. My little oasis in the middle of everything. As I settled into my corner by the window, the steady flow of customers and the clink of coffee cups felt comforting. But then, I noticed her. A girl sitting nearby, smiling like she recognized me. It wasn't until a stranger sat down across from me, asking too many questions and refusing to leave, that I began to realize something wasn't quite right. What happened next would leave me questioning how much of what we see is real, and how much is something darker. Stay with me, and I'll tell you what happened. But before we start, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you'll never miss a spine-tingling episode. If you're enjoying the content, don't forget to like, comment, and share the video. And if you want even more, stay connected with us on our social media platforms for more creepy content. Thank you all for being part of this journey with me. And now let's dive into the darkness together. I spent my first couple of years after high school just sort of drifting, trying to figure out what to do next. I bounced between a few dull jobs and kept signing up late for classes at different community colleges. This meant I spent a lot of time driving across the city, anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour, just to get where I needed to go. Many times, I found myself in unfamiliar parts of the city, and the suburbs felt so big and overwhelming. I honestly felt a bit lost. But there was one thing that grounded me: coffee. No matter where I was, I made sure to carve out time for a visit to Starbucks. I'd grab a coffee, sit down, and read. It became my way of coping with everything. A little piece of consistency in the middle of the chaos. I loved how Starbucks always felt familiar, even when everything else seemed new and confusing. One day, while waiting for a friend to get off work, I found myself at a Starbucks I hadn't been to before. When I walked in, I immediately noticed a girl sitting nearby. She looked familiar, but I couldn't place her. At that time, it felt like I was recognizing people from everywhere. Old friends, people from high school, or maybe even from work. She smiled when she saw me, but that was about it. We didn't really interact. The Starbucks was large, with several tables, a counter by the windows, and even some cozy armchairs near the back. The girl was sitting at a table near the door, and I picked a smaller one by the window where I could keep to myself. I probably ordered a mocha and then spread out my stuff. I tended to make a mess when I read. I had a notebook, a pen, my wallet, and of course my phone. I like to focus when I read, so I'll often get lost in the pages, not paying much attention to my surroundings. This time, when I finally looked up from my book, I noticed a guy sitting across from me. He looked around my age, wearing jeans even though it was still hot out. He didn't have a drink in front of him, and it didn't seem like he was planning on getting one. When he saw I noticed him, he started talking. He asked me things like my name, where I was from, and what I was reading. I immediately felt uneasy, but since I was trying to push myself out of my comfort zone and meet new people, I reluctantly answered his questions. Soon, he moved over to my table and casually told me he was new to the area. He asked where I was headed after this, and when I told him, he said he was going in the same direction. He didn't know the street names, but he could get around using landmarks. Even though I was trying to be social, something about him just didn't sit right with me. I didn't feel comfortable offering him a ride, so I told him I was staying for a couple more hours to wait for my friend. He didn't take that well and kept bringing up the ride, asking again and again. I made up some excuse each time, hoping he'd drop it, but he didn't, and we kept going in circles for maybe half an hour. Eventually, the conversation ran dry, and he started focusing more on my stuff. He picked up my notebook, asked to borrow my pen, and at one point, even picked up my wallet and started flipping through it. Back then, I was terrible at confrontation, so instead of demanding my stuff back, I just quietly packed up everything that wasn't already in his hands. Eventually, he said he needed to use the restroom. As soon as he left, the girl I'd noticed earlier came over. She asked if I was okay, and I told her I was, though I probably didn't look it. She told me not to give him a ride, and that I should ask him to leave me alone. She even waited with me until he came back, then firmly told him to leave me alone. He acted shocked and offended, but left without further argument. I probably should have left at that point, but I stayed and chatted with the girl for a little while. Eventually, a woman in her mid-30s walked in. She was wearing a low-cut blue dress, heavy makeup, and had her hair styled. She sat across from me and asked if my name was Dean. When I confirmed, she offered me $20 to give that guy a ride. I politely refused and stood up to leave. But as I walked to the door, I looked outside and saw the guy waiting by my car. The thing was, I hadn't told him which car was mine, and the parking lot was big. I glanced back at the woman, and she was just watching me, not offering any help. I felt the tension building. But instead of confronting him, I sat back down by the window, where I could keep an eye on my car. I was too nervous to call the police or make a scene, so I just pretended to read while keeping my gaze on the guy outside. Eventually, a security guard came up to him and told him to leave the area. When that happened, I didn't hesitate. I ran to my car and drove home as quickly as I could, making sure no one was following me. I never did figure out what that was all about, but I'm really grateful for that familiar face who helped me that day. Every Thursday, my routine never changed. It was like muscle memory. Wake up, throw on whatever clean clothes I had, and head to the Starbucks a few blocks away from my apartment. The coffee wasn't the best in the city, but it was convenient, and there was something comforting about the place. The warmth of the cafe enveloped me as soon as I walked in. The smell of espresso mixing with sweet vanilla and caramel. The baristas knew me well, and more often than not, they'd have my usual ready before I even ordered. It was a small thing, but it made the place feel like a second home. That Thursday, though, something felt off. At first I couldn't place it. Maybe I was just tired. But when I stepped inside and the door clicked shut behind me, I realized the usual hum of conversation wasn't there. It wasn't silent, just quieter, as if everyone was trying to stay out of sight. The line was shorter, with only 2 people ahead of me, and the baristas looked tense, glancing nervously at the pickup counter. That's when I saw her. A woman stood near the counter, gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles were white. Her face was pale, eyes flicking around the room. Our eyes met for a split second, and I saw something in her. Fear, maybe panic. But before I could think more on it, she looked away quickly. Her hands were shaking as she clutched her purse. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe she was anxious or waiting on bad news, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I ordered my usual iced caramel macchiato and moved to the side to wait. She was still there, shifting her weight from foot to foot, glancing at the door every few seconds. My curiosity grew, and I kept watching her. Then, the door slammed open, shaking the windows. 2 men barged in, faces hidden behind ski masks. The taller one was slim but looked strong, holding a knife in his hand like it was part of him. The shorter one was stockier, gripping a gun. The room froze. A collective gasp echoed, followed by the sound of people scrambling. "Get down!" the taller man shouted, his voice rough and commanding. The shorter man waved his gun, daring anyone to move. A woman screamed. Chairs scraped across the floor, cups fell, and ceramics shattered in the chaos. I ducked instinctively, pressing myself against the wall, my heart racing. The woman I'd been watching, still frozen, her eyes wide, caught the attention of the tall man, who moved toward her in a few long strides. He grabbed her arm, yanking her toward the center of the cafe. She struggled weakly, gasping. "Empty your purse," he ordered, his voice low but sharp. She fumbled with her purse, shaking so badly she almost dropped it. "Please, just," she whispered. But before she could finish, he snatched the bag from her hands and dumped its contents onto the floor. Wallet, keys, lipstick, receipts. "Where is it?" he demanded. I don't know what you mean," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The tension in the cafe thickened. People huddled in silence, hands shaking. One man near the window held his hands up, trembling uncontrollably. A mother shielded her child, holding her tightly. I wanted to do something, anything, but fear kept me frozen in place. The shorter man kept pacing, gun raised like a pendulum, his eyes sweeping the room. The The tall man's patience finally snapped. "I said, where is it?" he shouted. His voice cracked through the air like a whip, and before anyone could react, the knife flashed. It was too fast to comprehend. A sharp, wet sound filled the room, followed by a strangled gasp. The knife sank deep into her side. She staggered back, her eyes wide in shock, and blood spread across her clothes. Time seemed to freeze. Then she collapsed to the floor, her body hitting with a sickening thud. A sob broke the silence. It took me a moment to realize it was coming from me. My breathing was too loud, too fast. The tall man rifled through her purse, frustration growing on his face. Finding nothing, he cursed under his breath. "Forget it. Let's go," he ordered, and the shorter man nodded. Without another word, they bolted out the door, disappearing into the morning haze. The cafe fell into a suffocating silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. After a moment, a barista shakily grabbed her phone, dialing 911. Others began to cry, their sobs filling the tense stillness. I forced myself to move, my legs weak as I stumbled toward the woman. She was still, too still. I knelt beside her, my hands hovering over her body, unsure if there was anything I could do. But her chest wasn't rising. Her eyes, wide open, staring at the ceiling, were empty. The sirens came fast. Red and blue lights painted the windows in frantic colors, but it was too late. The paramedics were too late. I don't know how long I sat there staring at her before they finally made me stand up and answer their questions. My voice felt distant, like it wasn't even mine. I haven't been back to that Starbucks since. Now, every time I walk past, I feel it. The weight of that moment. The look in her eyes before she looked away. The blood on the floor and the helplessness. And I still wonder if there was something I could have done. But I'll never know. I've been working at Starbucks for a few weeks now. To be honest, the job is a bit chaotic, but it's nothing I can't handle. The usual rushes of people ordering lattes, frappuccinos, and everything else are typical. But there's always a group of regulars who make it a bit more interesting. One in particular stands out. A guy named Butch. He comes in every day, usually around the same time, and makes comments that make everyone uncomfortable. They're about the girls working the counter, always inappropriate stuff. Sometimes it's compliments, but more often than not, it's lewd remarks. He doesn't really care if they're 16 or 26, which makes things even worse. As bad as Butch is, that wasn't the scariest thing that happened to me at Starbucks. That came a few nights ago, when I was called in for the closing shift. I was supposed to be off, but they needed me to cover the last couple of hours, and I agreed. It had been a long day, and I was already feeling exhausted. Still, I showed up, ready to get through the last shift. By the time the store started to slow down, it was just me and a couple other employees left. The usual end-of-shift tasks needed to be done. Wiping down counters, refilling supplies, and of course, bringing in the patio furniture. I'd done it a million times before, so I wasn't thinking much of it when I went outside to do the usual. I propped the front door open, stepped outside, and started hauling in tables and chairs. The air was cool, but it was still relatively quiet outside. The parking lot wasn't empty, but there wasn't much going on at that hour. As I was moving the last of the chairs, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A man had appeared behind me, standing at the edge of the patio, just watching. I'm not a big guy, maybe 5 feet 6 inches on a good day, and definitely not someone who would intimidate anyone. I wasn't scared at first, just slightly thrown off by the fact that someone had appeared so suddenly and was standing so close to me. It's a weird thing, when you're just going about your business and suddenly you realize there's a stranger standing inches away. I kept working, hoping he'd go away, but he didn't. He just stood there silently. The more I tried to ignore him, the more his presence felt heavier. I was struggling to focus on my task, while also trying to keep track of what he was doing. He was towering over me, probably at least 6 feet 2 inches, built like he spent a lot of time at the gym. Every so often, I'd glance up, and there he was, staring. Not saying anything, not even moving, just staring. After what felt like an eternity of awkward silence, he finally broke the quiet by asking if I had a cigarette. The question caught me off guard. I mean, who stands behind someone in the dark, watching them work, and then asks for a smoke like it's a normal question? Maybe I'm overreacting, but it just didn't sit right with me. I don't smoke, so I told him that, and then tried to go back to what I was doing. But he didn't move. He just stood there, still staring. That's when I noticed that he was holding something in his hand. I couldn't make out exactly what it was, but it looked like some kind of object. I couldn't figure out if he was holding it casually or if he was trying to hide it. But either way, it made the whole situation feel even more unsettling. After a few minutes of this, I had had enough. I started to walk back inside, pretending like I needed to grab something, just so I could get away from him. The moment I stepped inside, I looked back, and there he was, right up against the window, still watching me. His face was pressed to the glass, like he didn't care that it looked creepy. It was almost like he wanted me to know that he was still there, still watching. I stepped back from the door, heart pounding. I was starting to feel really unsafe, but I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just ignore him and go back to my tasks. I knew I couldn't leave the store alone with him standing outside like that. I wasn't about to go out there, but the problem was, none of us were big enough to confront him, and none of us knew what to do. We were all a little shaken. For what felt like 20 minutes, he just stood there. By this time, it was well past closing, and the store was practically empty. Most of the staff was inside, and none of us felt comfortable enough to go out and confront him. We were all small. None of us felt like we could take this guy on if he decided to do something. The tension was so thick in the air, it was hard to breathe. At this point, we were starting to get really scared. One of the baristas suggested we call the cops, and we were all ready to do it. But before anyone had a chance to dial the number, the guy turned around and walked away. It was like nothing had happened. We stayed inside for a few minutes just to make sure he wasn't coming back. The fear didn't go away that easily. When I finally went to leave for the night, I checked the parking lot before heading to my car. I couldn't see him anywhere. It was still a little too quiet for my liking, but I didn't see him lurking around, so I decided to head out. I drove home that night with the feeling that something wasn't right. The whole incident had left me rattled, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. It was one of those moments that makes you realize just how unpredictable people can be. You can never really know who you're dealing with, or what their intentions are. That night I was just grateful I made it out of there safely. But I'll never forget the way he stood there, so close, just watching me. It's been a few days since it happened, and I've tried to shake it off. But honestly, I can't stop thinking about how quickly everything could have turned bad. Working late at Starbucks might seem harmless, but sometimes you're reminded that people can be a lot more unpredictable than you think. If you've experienced a terrifying event or have a horror story to tell, we at AG Horrors want to hear from you. Share your experiences with us on Reddit, and let's uncover the mysteries hiding in the shadows together. And if you want to support the channel and help us bring even more terrifying content, consider checking out our support options on Patreon or Ko-fi. Your support means the world to us. Be sure to like and subscribe to our channel for more spine-chilling stories like this one. And now, stay tuned for the next horror episode.